I'd just like to walk you through quickly the phases that we have been working on education since even before the actual constitution of the World University Consortium. This came to the front of our agenda at a meeting that was organized at the UN office June of 2013, which was really our conference, first a big major conference with a few hundred people on a new paradigm, most of them diplomats. And in one of the sessions, we had presentation by one of our fellows on the quantitative challenge that we face in education. Heitor alluded to it in his opening of the video, which some of you saw. Actually says, the data says that if we really wanted to provide quality education to all those who are seeking it in the future, in the next 20, 25 years, we'd virtually have to open a university, a high-class university every day for the next 15 or 20 years. Imagine the challenge. So it became really clear to us, because in all areas we're talking about, whether it's economy or employment or democracy or technology or environmental or law, rule of law, whatever it is, that education is a critical determinant. Having lived in India for decades, I commonly think that the single most important thing to do in a democracy is to educate the electorate, because they determine the quality of, and of course that applies equally to America as it does to India. And that's why we're talking about, that was a theme this morning, which Martin started off in and others mentioned, that education is so critical. So we started off focusing on the quantitative demand. And how are we going to meet that? And we organized a meeting at UC Berkeley in October of 2013 in collaboration with people from a number of top-level universities, including Cal and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and others, on how this could be done and how the emerging technology in higher education, the massive online open courses and everything, what role they may play in this process. And that was at the beginning, the time when Coursera and other, Udacity and others, edX, were just in their infancy. But one of the most surprising and interesting things that we learned in our interviews and discussions, we had people from Google there and from the universities there and from some of the learning companies there. One of the most surprising things we heard from the university, the top people in the universities, is, you know, we now realize that we've spent so many decades about thinking about that we want to teach in higher education, that we've spent almost no attention to how people learn or to the pedagogy. And of course this really comes up when you think of the possibility, the theoretical possibility of having world-class teachers, world-class faculty on video available to anybody in the world at virtually zero cost. Is that really all it's about? Then why do we need millions of teachers and everything if education is all about a lecture? And so we started research on the educational process. We started a series, after founding the World University Consortium, we found that there are themes that keep coming up in our academic conferences which require a more detailed focus than we can give in a conference which covers many different topics, and we're here today and gone the next day. So we kind of invented we are inventing a new type of process, which, for want of a better term, we called a course. I think it's really more realistically a course for the faculty than for anybody else, because it's really a learning process for us. And we started by looking at some of the fundamental themes that keep coming up in our conferences, but which we don't really get a chance to. to follow through in depth in a conference format. So we had the first three courses. One was on the role of the individual in development. And I must say the experience of having seen what happened because of Mikhail Gorbachev's initiatives, or studying what FDR did at the during the New Deal, or what Martin Luther King or Gandhi did outside of the governmental system, or what Steve Jobs did in terms of technology and that we have today, you see that our collective social science doesn't really reflect the true potential creative power of an individual. And obviously then our capacity to generate creative individuals or unleash that capacity becomes a great determinant of what's going to happen to society in the future. In a second course, we were really focusing on social process, not the problems of society. How does society evolve? How do we create? How do we become more effective? What's the role of the individual? What's the role of institutions? What's the role of social energy? How does the social energy get released? What's the role of values? And all of these factors. We were really concentrating on a theme that came up this morning. How do we change? How does society change? And these meetings tended to interact with each other and build on each other, and each time we were getting greater insights into something. The third one we had this year in March on leadership, because the theme kept coming up in all of our conferences, well, without leadership, it's not going to happen. What is leadership? What do we really mean by it? What type of leadership? The phrase came up, transformational leadership. You would have heard Alexander in the video clip saying leadership is about uncorking the future. And how can we develop leaders? And how does that relate to the subject of individuality, which we were looking at earlier, and the role of values? In the next phase, we said, well, let's come to the real issue of pedagogy, of how education is being conducted in the universities today. And that was the 3-day course we just completed at Dubrovnik in September, and of which Stefan was a very major and very provocative contributor. I thought that was really interesting. The data he presented was that when we listen to a lecture, our retention level averages maybe 5%. When we read, 10%. When it's in a discussion group, when we discuss something, maybe 50%. And when we teach others, up to 90%. And this so much is confirmed by my own experience, and I think for all of us, we really learn the most when we teach somebody else. So we have a pedagogy now, a world prevalent pedagogy now, which is designed to maximize the learning of the instructors rather than the students. And so the question is, how can we flip that model? And that's why the data that Stefan was presenting was so interesting. By the end of that course, we felt we had very rich discussion, and it's not that we have exhausted any of these topics. These are topics for further research and further programming, and we'll take them and bring them out at conferences. But already we found we were coming to another topic, which has been fundamental to all the discussions in the Academy since we started on New Paradigm. But it took us a while to kind of get down to it. And I was very happy because it was prevalent in almost all of the discussion and presentation we had this morning. And I alluded to it in my opening remarks, that our problems are not just a question of the quantity of education we have or the particular theoretical conceptions that we have, but the very way in which we're using the mind and the way we're thinking. And isn't it worthwhile that we look at the way we are using the mind's processes and how our minds have been conditioned to work in a particular way? There are a number of dimensions of this. Alberto frequently is referred to the social construction of knowledge. As we we take what we've learned from the society as actually our way of looking at things, and we don't even know it's a framework. We take it for reality. We mistake the framework for reality. Thomas Borkman, because he wanted to cover other things this morning, one of the recurring themes in his book is that we really take, he showed you the map of the gaps between the model of economy and the way economy is and the way economy is and the way it could be. And I think he alluded to the fact that when people learn economics, they're taught this is economy. This is not a model of economy. This is the way economy works. We are not conscious of the conceptual frameworks we're in. Martin talked about the shift from a reductionist silo-based thinking to a systems thinking which would take into account complexity. So we have a proposal now which the board has agreed yesterday that in the next course we're going to look at what we call ways of thinking. A couple of years ago we had a meeting at Trieste. In fact, Emil was the moderator for the court. We had a session on genius, and Emil was the moderator. We had a number of interesting presentations there, and there one of the points that was discussed is what do we mean by a genius? Is a genius simply a quantitative increase in some type of intellectual capacity, or does a genius do something different with his mind than we normally do in our patterns of thinking? Is at least part of genius a question of thinking in a different way and not just a quantitative distinction? And it's very interesting when you look at great scientific discoveries like that. The great scientific discoveries were discoveries to discover a relationship between phenomena that previously seemed to be unrelated or independent of one another. Whether it's Newton discovering that there's a relationship between the inert object and the moving object, or Einstein between gravity and acceleration, or whatever it may be, or the unification of electricity and magnetism. And how do we come out of our conception that things are separate phenomena? And what is that relationship that enables us to see a connection between them? And does it have something to do with our mental processes? It's always intrigued me the fact that in science we spend all our training is on the scientific method of how do we validate or falsify a result. But what about the real creative process that leads to the hypothesis in the first place? We know very little about that. So the topic that I'm calling it, we can call it by anything, the topic is thinking, but Stefan introduced it in Dubrovnik under the topic of creative thinking, and I'm just going to do this for a few minutes just to summarize what we have been discussing. Many of the speakers this morning have come to the conclusion or commented on the fact that an analytic mode of thinking that reduces things to smaller and smaller parts, breaks things up and looks at them in isolation, is certainly a major source of the problems we have today in the conceptual frameworks with which we're trying to deal with problems in society. And this is a new theme. Over the last 50, 60 or more years, we've had a major challenge to the reductionist framework from the rise of systems thinking that realizes that we need to see how things are connected with each other. We need to study those interconnections. We need something that's more systemic or more synthetic. It looks at the whole and not just the parts. It looks not only to what distinguishes things from each other, but what they have in common or how they are part of a larger process. And we have in the thinking that's been discussed this morning, it's clear we have come away from that reductionism, and we see that in the discussions wherever we go. But we've inherited from the 19th century, from the natural sciences, another dimension, and that is, even when we think systemically, a systemic perception can still be a mechanistic perception. And when we really want to talk about the society, human society that we're trying to understand, we're not just talking about a complex system. We're talking about a conscious system. We're talking about a living system. We're talking about a system that has different aspirations, different values, different attitudes, different needs. And therefore, simply to look at it holistically doesn't ensure that we're really going to get to the essential knowledge. I recently came across a book to clarify my thought. It's by a mathematician named William Byers from Canada, in which he explains something that we've been trying to do, and he explained it so clearly that I understood what we were trying to do better. And his argument was very simple. He said that we learn by learning through a paradigm, and every learning experience is a learning experience within a conceptual framework or a conceptual system or a paradigm, whatever you want to do. As a teacher of mathematics, he says, through the course of our lives, all of us learn to move from one paradigm to another. And he uses math as the example to say, when you learn that numbers signify the counting of a quantity, it's different than when you learn numbers as fractions or when you learn negative numbers. Each one is a different paradigm. And when you try to understand accounting, you try to understand negative numbers when you're in the paradigm that a number represents a number of objects. A negative number makes no sense from that point of view. And he went on to expand, and the conclusions he drew were, one, that all our knowledge is based within a paradigm, but when we're in the paradigm, we're not aware of the walls, we're not aware of the rules until we come out of it. We think this is the way of looking at reality. And all our progress has been by the capacity to move beyond the limitations of a paradigm. But one of the characteristics of a paradigm is when you're within it, anybody who's speaking from outside it makes no sense at all, because it doesn't make sense from inside. It doesn't make sense from within the assumptions, just like relativity theory makes no sense from inside the paradigm of Newtonian mechanics, or even somebody was mentioning at lunch thermodynamics, and just like the heliocentric view makes no sense from within the perspective of a geocentric thing. So I started to rethink what we've been doing in terms of new paradigm, and in terms of what are the thought processes that will help us transit from one to the other. And what Byers says, which was, I think, a very accurate description for us, we tend not to move out of a paradigm until we meet with irreconcilable objects that cannot be resolved within the present frame. We do everything we can to resolve it within the present frame, and when we can't, we are forced out. And therefore, the confrontation of contradictions that are unresolvable within the present frame is really the catalyst for the evolution and development of our thinking processes. So that's what we are grappling with in the academy, and that's what the world is grappling with today. And it's a very rich discussion. Their specific topics comes to the point of showing where the limits of a particular framework and urging us to go on. So the topic and Byers' whole theme is, we've already moved through so many paradigms without knowing it. Nobody taught us that we were moving from one to the other. Why can't in the educational process, why can't we teach the process of moving from one to another? Instead of rejecting contradictions, well, that's wrong because from my point of view, it has to be this. We are alerted to the fact that what looks like a contradiction from a wider framework can really be part of a greater perspective. So we thought as the next step in our pursuit of education, directly as a part of the New Paradigm Project, we wanted to explore this process more fully. We'll have a meeting on it, and then see how that clarifies our own thinking on what we mean paradigm here, and how that could be introduced in the educational system. And if we understand that the problem is really, to a large extent, not exclusively that, there are vested interests, there are things that are not intellectual at all. There's the social power equations that I don't care what you say, I want this, this is mine, and I'm going to hold on to it. That doesn't depend on, that's not a paradigm problem, that's a power problem. But that paradigm, that our intellectual problems are real, the more we understand about our own perspectives, the more we understand about the process by which we've come out of them, the more effective we should be in being able to relate to and present things in a way that will naturally facilitate this evolutionary process, which is happening all around. We're now all thinking as, not all, but we are discussing today from a perspective of systems perspective or complexity, which was totally foreign when I was growing up. We have made a shift. How do we make that shift further? Thank you.